All right, so welcome parents to another conversation starter. You already know how we start this off with a clap. Pastor Mario.
Dawson, the youth leader.
Walker behind the camera. And so this past week, yesterday, we had youth group. A lot of your students weren't there. I think we had 3 students total, which is understandable because we had a lot of snow. Roads were kind of...
we had a snowstorm.
You
were talking,
you know
like
what I
nobody
mean?
showed up.
It was like, I'm just kidding. No, it was pretty bad. I mean, I think by the time youth group started, some of the roads were starting to really lighten up. Yeah. So either way, roads were bad, snowstorm hit, understandable that students stayed home, but that didn't stop us from actually still having the lesson and still talking about what God put on your heart with the attribute of God's self-sufficiency.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That is all to say. The fact that we had less students, to say that there will be more of a lesson in this video so that you can convey more of a lesson since they didn't have it.
Yeah.
Yep. There's no conversation to start. There's a full lesson to be had.
Yeah. Because that's, your students weren't there, understandably, but that means the more of the weight on the teaching aspect of this idea of God's self-sufficiency, which Dawson's going to give us, a mini version of what he talked about with us yesterday. But the ball is going to be in your court, parents, to take what you hear here about God's self-sufficiency, look up the scriptures yourself, look into it, Google things if you need to, read your Bible even before you have to, or before you sit down and have the devotional time with your students. But all that to say is the ball is in your court to really make sure that you are communicating with them the idea of God's self-sufficiency so that they understand this idea of his attribute. Yeah. And so obviously you will fuel their fires.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not saying we're giving you nothing. We're just giving you...
End the video now.
Yeah. They don't have 2 full lessons. They'll only have 1. But we talked about God's self-sufficiency.
What is it? What does it mean for God to be self-sufficient?
So the way you can define it at home, if they don't know what it means to be self-sufficient, you can do one hand is self and ask them what your self is. And then one hand is sufficient. And I gave sufficient the definition of lacking nothing. Just an easier way to put it because it's a fancy word. But and so if you meld them together, it's lacking nothing outside of yourself. So God within himself lacks nothing. He has everything he needs. Yeah. And so we covered that with 3 points, which is that God is self-sufficient as creator / provider. Yeah. And so that those 2 go together because God was sufficient to create. He created purely outside of himself. And because God doesn't change, so his power doesn't change, he created purely out of himself. And he continues to do so. So he provides purely out of himself. So they go hand in hand. And I gave the example of Job and God's confrontation and God's response to Job's doubt about why he hasn't been providing for him is pointing back to himself as creator.
Now, which scripture is that if parents want to...
That is Job 38, 1 through 7.
There you go. If you want to read that passage with your student to kind of hone in on that point, that's there for you. All right, continue.
And but God's response to Job is, where were you when I laid the foundation? Yeah. Where were he even asks him, like, do you know the measurements of the earth? Like,
it's pretty profound.
Like, God is so in-depth and creative that he understands fully all of the earth. And so that was the first point. And the second point was introduced the contrast that I really want to hone in on with self-sufficiency, where we come into it, there's a contrast between being needed and being wanted. And so the second point is that God is sufficient in love. And what that means is that God, being triune, has actually always been sufficient in being love, because he is love, but he's always been able to show love.
To express it.
Yeah, without us, he wasn't lacking that.
Yeah.
So he doesn't need us. Notice need. He doesn't need us for that aspect of his character.
Yeah.
He has that aspect in himself because he himself is three. And so he doesn't need us for that. And that's important coming up later, but I wanted to really hone in on that so that we would get that idea that God in the Trinity is sufficient in love. Because in 1 John 4 is where I referenced, God is referenced as he is love.
Yep.
And so we have to understand he is love now, and he expresses love to us, but he's actually always been love because he's expressed love in himself in the Trinity.
Always, yeah.
Always.
Yeah.
And so, and the verse I gave for that was John 1:1. You know, very simple. Like, in the beginning there was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. That's,
but then
that's
your first,
before us.
Yeah.
You know?
Yep. It's before all things, in the beginning.
Yeah. And so that feeds into the point that God was sufficient in his sacrifice.
Okay.
So
which is your third point.
Yeah. If we're not needed, then that means that Jesus' death on the cross was a pure act of love. So I gave the example of, like, someone saves your life, and you're like, wow, thank you for saving my life. And the response to you is, I did it because I need you to do this thing. You know, like, I think I said, like, I need you to mow my lawn. Like, something, anything would seem weird at that point.
Like, oh man, I just almost died.
Yeah. And so it's like, is that love, or is saving your life and saying, no, I did it because I loved you. I expect nothing in return. And so that is what we're talking about with Jesus' sacrifice, is not, no, I couldn't exist without you because I needed you. It's because he wanted us. And that's where that contrast comes back in, where we are deeply wanted, but not at all needed. You know?
Yep.
And
That's
that
good.
fed into the idea that he includes us in things. So if God is sufficient, then the fact that we're included in anything, it's all our honor.
Yeah.
And so that,
Privilege.
for that, it's 2 Corinthians 5, pretty
Yeah.
much just the whole chapter, but it's just Paul talking about the honor that it is that God would send Jesus so that we would be included in things that he did not have to include us in. And really from creation, God has been doing that, where he's been giving us things to do that he could do better himself.
He could do himself way faster than we would ever get it done.
Yeah. And I gave the example of Paul. I asked the students, I was like, who evangelized to Paul? Jesus. He came down and he did it himself.
Yeah.
And he could do that to everyone.
Yeah.
But he chooses to include us in that process.
Yeah.
And so it's, again, that contrast of we're not needed, but we are deeply wanted.
That's good.
So that's what I would emphasize most out of self-sufficiency, is that God may not need us, but he shows that he wants us very deeply.
That's good. Yeah, so God is self-sufficient, meaning he does not lack anything. He has everything that he needs in himself.
Yeah.
Totally. And in his self-sufficiency is expressed. You know, these aren't the only ways, but these are the ways that you're honing in on. In his creativity, in his provision, in his love for us, but it's based on the love that he's had for all eternity with him, within himself, in the Godhead, and his sufficiency of his sacrifice for us. Because of his great love for us and his ability to be self-sustaining in his provision, he is able to save us to the utmost, like Hebrews says. And so I think it's a great message on God's self-sufficiency. We were talking to the kids about, like, this is a good, like, this this is a good thing. And I think I even told you, this is probably one of the moods of God. Besides His holiness. His holiness is like, His holiness determines that everything else about God is set apart. But second to that, I think, is His self-sufficiency. The fact that God does not need anything. He is self-sustaining by Himself. He is self-sufficient. He is self-reliant. He doesn't need counsel. He doesn't need knowledge. He's not lacking in any like strength.
Yeah.
You know, he can do everything himself. But the privilege, like you said, that He includes us, you know, in the Great Commission, in evangelism, in all these different things. And we get to do that because God is good. So, some questions for the parents as you guys are taking that in, and maybe you're mulling it over, you're trying to think about, okay, how am I going to communicate this with my student? You know, what would be best? Should I say the same 3 points? Should I say it in a different way? Whatever the case. You know, we have 2 questions that can kind of lead to some more open conversation, possibly. So I would say, I'll start us off with the first question. I would say read John 6, 1 through 15. So in John 6, this is the passage where Jesus is feeding the 5,000. This isn't the only time He does this. He also feeds 4,000.
One of a few times.
So, like, I'm not going to give anything away, but read this whole section of this and ask your student, how does this scenario reveal God's sufficiency to create and to provide? So both.
At the same time.
At the same time, you know, whatever the case, like, you know, encourage them to look in the scriptures for a specific verse that kind of shows that God is either creating or providing or all in the same go. And point it out and talk about it and, like, you know, talk about, like, oh, this is Jesus doing this. He's a human. You can even get into a Trinitarian conversation with that. I mean, it's like,
good.
You know, so it can go multiple ways. But really, honestly, just read that passage together and then just ask your student, like, all right, how does this scenario, what Jesus is doing here, reveal this attribute of God's creativity and provision and His self-sufficiency? And I think, you know, it might be very cut and dry. It might be very open conversation. Either way, get your student to actually dig and find the verse and the scripture.
And just really look at the beauty of what Jesus is doing, because He's doing it. There is no external source. That He just breaks the bread. He prays over it and He breaks it and He provides. And it's such a beautiful image of self-sufficiency that we don't get that often. You know, we don't stop and look at it in a real world sense that often. But He's not like, give me more bread, I need more. He's just doing it. You know, He's just providing.
And I think a lot of students maybe even read this passage. Sorry, I'm checking the time of where we're at. Okay, we're good. Oh, nice. Thanks, Walker. Walker behind the camera. All right, 5 minutes left. All right, so.
He panicked you, though.
It's like, oh, God, what are we doing? It's good. It's good. So just read that passage. It'll be really fun. Second question. I think you came up with it.
So this is keeping in mind that contrast of not being needed, but being wanted. And so ask them why it's a good thing that God desires us in this way. Not needing us, but desires us. It's a good question because I think that a lot of times we, just in our culture, the idea is to be needed. Like that feels more important. But I think if you stop and think about it, you realize that being wanted and chosen is the more important of the two.
Oh, it's the more important. I would even say that that's what people really actually want. They want to be chosen. They want to be wanted.
And we talked about, like, with the Great Commission, it's not an obligation because it's not what we were needed for. It is actually a privilege and an honor because it's what we were wanted for. And so if you need a hint for them as well, you can read Romans 5, 7, and 8. And just, again, see the contrast of how deeply we were not required for God's holiness. It even in the passage goes as far as to be like we were enemies of God. We were so far removed from his holiness. And yet he still wanted us so deeply that he included us in it.
That's a good contrast. Yeah.
And don't pull that out right at the start. Leave that as a hint.
Yeah. Or even just like, have them answer the question and then read it to kind of fuel more conversation with it.
But yeah, get them to think about that contrast between, like, why should we want to be wanted by God? Why should we enjoy that? As opposed to just thinking that we
are needed.
Like, don't let them feel purposeless and not being needed. Because that's the danger of hearing that God is self-sufficient, is that you remove yourself.
Yeah.
But in reality, he still wants us so deeply. And it's emphasized by the fact that he has no need. He has no need to want us, but he does.
Yeah. I think it's good, man. And I think you did great. We had 3 students, but I think a lot of the students' parents are going to enjoy the conversation about this because it's just fascinating to learn about God. Again, this is the goal of going through the attributes, is that we get to know God more. This is the whole point. And I told this with the kids, is that, we do this all the time. We have friends, they have friends, and the reason they become friends is because they get to know the person.
Yeah.
They get to know this person, they get to know their hobbies, learn their likes, learn what they don't like, learn their character traits. Yeah. And so it's the same with God. God is pretty much giving us an into his personal
into
nature. I mean, I don't know how else to say it. His personhood.
Yeah.
And so, so have fun with this, have a great conversation, and we just pray that it goes well. And this coming Sunday will be a Q&A night. So it's not going to be a normal youth group with the lesson stuff. It's going to be a Q&A night, and we're going to be tackling a question: if God, or if the Big Bang is true, does it disprove the existence of God? So that's the question we're going to be talking about. And encourage your students to come, encourage them to bring friends. Again, this would be a great thing to invite, non-Christian students to, because this is just stuff that they're already hearing and listening to. So anyways, parents, we hope you guys have a great week and some good conversations come up. Hello, parents. This is Pastor Mario. Thank you guys for joining us for this week's conversation starter. If you want more ways that you can engage with your youth, you could check out the other conversation starters here on my side. Thank you guys for joining us. Hope you guys are doing well.